Five, four, three, two, one. And we are here with Kevin McDonald. He is here to discuss his book, GamerGate, The First Battle of the Culture War, with us today. Thanks for joining us, Kevin.
Thank you for having me on, Joe.
All right, yeah, so the usual first question here is, tell us your story about how you managed to get involved in the IDW, become a fan and follower. What was the pathway that brought you here?
All right. Well, I sort of got involved in these similar conversations about identity politics, about politics and society more generally, around 2015. Before that, I was pretty apolitical, didn't really follow politics, didn't really care. I mean, I had some general political views on some topics, but didn't really look into it, didn't really care too much. But around 2015, I started looking into it through the GamerGate conflict. But I didn't really discover the IDW until much later. And the IDW didn't really start as a thing until much later. But I'd say around last year, I started following Sam Harris a lot more and listening to his stuff. I'd heard some of his stuff before and liked it, but I didn't really start listening to his podcast regularly until around late 2016 or maybe 2017, 2018. And from there, I discovered Joe Rogan, really liked his stuff. Discovered Ben Shapiro, liked some of his stuff. He does get a bit partisan hacky in his podcast. I guess if you talk about politics for 4 hours a day for 5 days a week, you sort of generally develop a partisan bias, or you generally are a little bit less nuanced because there's so much to cover and you just go with the flow and your audience wants you to throw red meat out there. But I generally like Sam Harris and Joe Rogan and Ben Shapiro and the content they're putting out there, and Jordan Peterson more recently. So I just sort of started following their stuff and posting on the Sam Harris subreddit. I discovered the IntellectualDarkWeb subreddit, and here I am.
All right. Well, we're glad to have you here. So I took a brief look at your book, which you sent to me, and just so the listeners can know, you have published it now on Amazon's, and it's available for Kindle and paperback, so be sure to check it out. Again, it's GamerGate, The First Battle of the Culture War. I took a brief look at it just so I could get a general idea of what the book is, but I tried to remain as ignorant as possible so I can kind of learn about what your ideas are in real time alongside our listeners here. And one thing that you mentioned, you hint at this in the book, and you hinted at it in some of our direct messages in the lead up to this recording, is that you see GamerGate in many ways as sort of a prelude or a foreshadowing of the intellectual dark web, and that it involves a lot of the same actors, even if we're not talking about what I often term the inner ring. So talking about Shapiro, Harris, Rogan, the Weinsteins, that general group. You see that there's sort of this relevant chronology from GamerGate to the intellectual dark web today. Would you like to sort of explain your thoughts on that?
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, these are different groups, and they focus on different things. For instance, GamerGate focused more on the video games industry, whereas the intellectual dark web is more about general society. So they are pretty different, but as someone who was involved with GamerGate, we talked a lot about the same issues that now dominate our political discourse today. A lot of these issues around identity, a lot of these issues around censorship, around this sort of radicalization we see online with the far left and the far right. We were talking about a lot of those same issues, but within the context of video games. And that's sort of why the book is called First Battle of the Culture War. It obviously wasn't the very first battle, the very first debate ever to be had, but it was the first really major conversation where you had tens of thousands of people, just normal people, normal gamers, talking about these topics and discussing them and debating them. And it really opened the door to having bigger conversations that we see now with the intellectual dark web. You see the topics that Jordan Peterson is talking about. You see the topics that Sam Harris is talking about, so on and so forth. And they touch upon many of the same themes, in part identity, in part censorship, in part this sort of general malaise that you see in society, where people feel like they have no purpose, they have no meaning in society, where they're lost and they're confused and they don't know what to do. And that's something Jordan Peterson talks about a lot. And this is also a theme you started to see with the GamerGate community, because we were pushing back against people who had some very radical notions in the gaming industry. And we provided a counterpoint using many of the same arguments that you now see in the mainstream. And of course, more generally, I'd say as the people in GamerGate, a huge swath of the people in GamerGate went on to become big fans of people like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and so on and so forth. And as for the major participants themselves, they haven't really talked about GamerGate. I did actually get an email from Ben Shapiro asking me if I want to write an article about GamerGate on his website, the Daily Wire.
Oh, okay.
And that was about a year and a half ago. I never took him up on it. I should have.
You really should have. I mean, I have a lot of, we'll say, political disagreements with Ben Shapiro, but if he asked me to write an article on his website, I'd be more than happy to. I mean,
yeah, I was in my final year of college at the time, so I was super busy and I was working full time, and I'm just like, I don't have the time for this right now. But I appreciate him sending the offer.
All right. Well,
and of course, I think Dave Rubin and Rogan have also briefly talked about it with their other guests.
Right. I remember seeing an episode of the Rubin Report where Dave mentioned that. One thing I want to clarify a bit is the term GamerGate seems to have multiple meanings, and it seems to run along the spectrum of an incident, as most things with the suffix gate indicate, but it also has a double meaning for a community of people. So could you sort of elaborate what those meanings are and sort of explain like the incident itself, and then who constituted the GamerGate community in the fallout?
Sure. Actually, I spend the first chapter of the book talking largely about that, because it's so hard for a layperson to understand, because you hear it used in so many different contexts. Like you said, is it a controversy, an event, something that happened, or is it a movement of people, or what exactly is it? And so I spent a lot of time trying to lay out what exactly it is. And I think the best definition I've come up with is it's a cultural flashpoint. It's an event that happened, yes. You see, a lot of games journalists come out all within a period of a couple of days writing articles saying, hey, gamers are sexist, gamers have a lot of problems, we need to move past these problems, and they're using a lot of vitriolic language, which really kicked off GamerGate. So you see an event, and for the first few months, that's what most people thought of it as, an event. It's just these games journalists who are engaging in corruption, or we perceive them as engaging in corruption, and they're insulting their audience in many respects. And it's just an event, a controversy. But as time went on, it started to be viewed more as a community, because two camps of people had formed. You had a group called pro-GamerGate and a group called anti-GamerGate. And the pro-GamerGate people felt like the games press was ideologically driven, that they weren't interested in hearing what their consumers had to say, and were, rather than responding to criticism by saying, okay, look, we made some mistakes, we were going to look into this, we're going to do better, we apologize, instead of showing some graciousness, they decided to double down and defend their own people, to circle the wagons. And so on the one side, you had the people who thought this is bad, and the other side, you saw people who thought, you know what, all this criticism of games journalism is just a distraction, and all these people really hold sexist views. And so you saw these two communities form, and then as years go by, these people who are talking to each other on Twitter in either respective camp, they have a community of people. They have friendships. They go out and have meetings in real life. That's something we've done a lot of, where we'll meet with people who support GamerGate or who oppose GamerGate, and we'll have beers with them, and we'll have conversations with them. And so you see the developments of a community, but that wasn't what it started out as. It started out as a controversy, like you say.
Okay, and what were the details of this controversy?
Oh gosh, that's a lot. I'll try to keep it relatively brief.
Okay.
It started out, well, before GamerGate even happened, before there was a big controversy a big blow up like this, there was a lot of distrust between gamers and the games press already. There was this general feeling that the games press were getting paid off to promote certain products, to write reviews that were favorable or articles that were favorable to certain publishers,
Right,
so on
because
and so forth.
there were a lot of disappointing games. I mean, there have been for many years, but also before that, where they get like a 9.5 out of 10, and it's a mediocre game at best.
Right. You definitely saw a lot of that. And you saw some weird instances, like the Doritos Gate controversy. I'm not sure if you know about that.
You know,
so prior
I
to
wish I did.
GamerGate, there was Doritos Gate. There was a games journalist who was running a talk show on YouTube, and he was talking about video games and promoting video games, and he was really heavily promoting certain products that had nothing to do with video games. He was heavily promoting Mountain Dew. He was heavily promoting Doritos, and like to the extent where his background. So he's sitting down in a chair in an office room, right, and or meeting room, and all around him are posters for Mountain Dew. It's like, really, dude? What is going on here? He's getting paid off by Mountain Dew to promote the product, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you saw that. You also saw Jeff Gerstmann. He was a writer for GameSpot. He had been fired over his review of Kane and Lynch. He gave the game a negative review, and he got fired for it.
Mm.
And they suspect that it was because the company, the developer, was advertising pretty heavily on GameSpot at the time. And they didn't want to lose the advertising revenue, so they fired him. At least that was the theory at the time. And Jeff Gerstmann has come out and later said that that's what happened. So obviously, we don't have what the company said. We don't know what the company's internal discussion was about that, but he says that that's the reason he was fired. Okay. So there was a lot of distrust going in. Then you see this man named Aaron Joney in August 2014. He writes a blog post mostly for himself, right? He writes a blog post saying, you know, my girlfriend cheated on me with Nathan Grayson. Nathan Grayson's a writer for Kotaku, a former writer for Rock, Paper, Shotgun. These are two relatively big video game journalism sites. He says that my girlfriend cheated on me with these people. And his girlfriend is a game developer. So people are like, wait a second. She was sleeping with Nathan Grayson, the writer for Rock, Paper, Shotgun. And Nathan Grayson has been promoting her game. He didn't write a review of her game or anything like that, but he wrote an article where he highlighted 3 games that had just came out. And he was saying that these 3 games really stand out of the crowd of 50 games. So her game got front and center coverage over 47 other games that came out in that month. And these were mostly indie games. So people are like, well, wait a second, what's going on here? Started asking questions. And there were some people who were going too far. There were some people who were engaging in sort of sexist stereotypes of, you know, oh, she's a whore, she's an X, she's a Y, right? There were people saying that stuff, especially in like the 4chan community, you know, anonymous communities where people could say whatever they want. Some people said some nasty stuff. Then Kotaku releases an article, this editor-in-chief does, where Nathan Grayson now works. He says, Stephen Totillo, the editor, says that, you know what, we looked into this. As far as we can tell, the relationship started a week or 2 after the article came out. So he says that there was no wrongdoing because the relationship started after they were officially dating. And people were like, well, wait a second. Even if they weren't dating at the time, they at the very least had a close personal friendship. And you can see this going back years where they're sharing hotel rooms together at conventions and doing live streams together from the hotel rooms, so on and so forth. And they're also working together on a game. They were both working on an indie game together before the relationship officially started.
Yeah, and a week does not seem like a good enough space of time to clear the concerns that have been raised about a conflict of interest like that.
Right. And so people were like, well, this is not even attempting to address the concerns that people have. This is just a PR statement trying to sort of cast doubt on the claims. Then we found more evidence of corruption. There's instances of another writer for Kotaku, Patricia Hernandez, and she's promoting a game of her roommate. Her roommate releases a game, an indie game, and she writes a bunch of glowing articles about it. People are like, well, what's going on here? Why is your writer, who is admitting to being the roommate of this person, writing all these glowing articles about her game? All right, that seems like a conflict of interest, right? Even if there's nothing romantic going on there, they're at the very least friends or roommates. That's too close of a relationship to have to discuss that without disclosing it at the very least. But there's no disclosure here. And then Kotaku does actually do the right thing in this case. They say, okay, we messed up. And they do decide to put disclosures on the article. So power to them, right? They did the right thing in that instance. A couple of days later, August 28th goes by. August 28th, a bunch of articles come out saying that gamers are over, gamers are dead, right? The gaming community and the gamer identity is toxic. That the gaming community is full of sexists, the gaming community is full of racists, right? That it has serious problems, and we have to move past this by adopting a new label. Get rid of the gamer label, adopt a new label. Some of the articles were relatively nuanced. Other articles that came out, again, they were talking about a dozen articles. Some of the articles were really hostile and filled with social justice language. So there's a variety of different takes, but they're all roughly saying the same thing.
And that's a pretty bold statement. By. Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement. I mean, get rid of the gamer identity. That's like tell FIFA fans, you know what, the footballer identity needs to go.
Right. There's too many football hooligans. We need to get rid of the footballer identity, right? It would be absurd.
Right. And it would
so
cause
the gaming Oh yeah. I'm sure a lot of football fans would feel pretty pissed off, and a lot of gamers did. And so there was this revolt against these articles. And that's when GamerGate really kicked off. And Adam Baldwin, he tweeted out on the hashtag the day before, actually. He was following the corruption story with Patricia Hernandez and Nathan Grayson before GamerGate really kicked off and the articles came out. And he tweeted out about this the day before the articles dropped, saying, we need to talk about this corruption, hashtag GamerGate. The next day, the articles come out. The GamerGate hashtag at this point blows up because it's not just about the corruption anymore. Now it's about an attack on the gaming community itself. And from there, you see people launching like advertising boycotts. So they start emailing the advertisers of these websites like Kotaku and so on, saying, hey, these companies are insulting the audience. We don't think you should be advertising here. And so a bunch of advertisers like Intel pull out. And a bunch of other, like there's car companies that pulled out advertisements, a whole bunch of companies, like a toothpaste company, Colgate, they pulled out their advertisements and so on and so forth in response to this boycott. And from there, you sort of see these two communities develop. One saying that the gaming community is toxic and that these people, these GamerGaters, represent the toxic element. On the other side saying, no, we're just talking about corruption. We're just talking about our audience being attacked, and we're just talking about censorship of games, which was becoming a theme because you saw some of these articles that came out. These Gamers Did articles and some of the other articles that followed them. They were talking about needing to change the games that are being made because the games themselves are promoting toxicity. The games themselves are promoting sexist ideas about women and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot going on all at one time. Sorry, that's a long answer.
Well, maybe that's the best we can do. But that's the incident, more or less.
Yes, that's the incident.
All right. And one thing I did notice in some of my perusal of your book was this has often been compared to an allegory of a cafeteria hall, which I thought was pretty interesting. Did you want to sort of explain that and why I think it's a very incisive way of describing the controversy?
Definitely, yes. That's probably the best analogy I've heard, and that comes from two people. They did videos on this. You can look it up yourself. Troy Levitt, and he's a game developer for Disney Interactive, and PSA Sitch. He's if you want to look up GamerGate Easy Cartoon Explained, he made that video, and we're used to the cafeteria analogy, where you have a couple tables in a banquet hall, right? There's a banquet hall with 100 tables, let's say. And there's like one table that is talking about this corruption stuff that's going on, like the Nathan Grayson and Patricia Hernandez corruption. They're very skeptical of the games press. You have another table who is basically slinging shit, right? These are the 4chan type people. They're kind of saying some nasty stuff about women, right? The games press looks at the two tables. They say, okay, you know what? This one table is full of sexists. The other, or trolls at least, maybe not, they're probably not serious sexists, probably just trolling, right? It's a drama, it's a controversy. So there's trolls here, and then there's another table, and they're like, well, these people are covering for the trolls. They're not much better. And so from there, they get up on the table, they stand up on the table, the games journalists do, and they say, hey, wait a second. Gamers are sexist, and even if they aren't sexist, they're covering for sexists. And the other 97 tables in the banquet hall are like, what the fuck are you talking about? Because they're not the ones engaging in that behavior. They don't even know about the ethics stuff, most likely. They're just, enjoying their meal, playing their games, doing their own thing. And now the games press paints with a broad brush and says, because this one table is engaging in bad behavior, now all gamers, or the gaming community at large, has a problem. And they cast with a very broad brush rather than being specific and saying these specific individuals, the specific group is bad. Rather than doing that, they say the gaming community itself is toxic.
Right. And that, I think, really shows what the connection between GamerGate and the intellectual dark web really is. Because on several issues, you've seen that same tactic employed by the social justice warrior types against members of the intellectual dark web. We've seen that against Sam Harris for his statements on Islam, right? So Sam Harris will make a criticism of Islam. And then basically what the hardcore liberals do is they say, well, this neo-Nazi, let's say that somebody who's actually a neo-Nazi is critical of Islam.
The Christchurch shooter, right?
Right. Sam Harris is critical of Islam. So all people who are critical of Islam are neo-Nazis. They basically give Sam Harris that treatment. A similar thing was done to Brett Weinstein for his statements on the day of absence, and how Evergreen State College changed the tradition and used its position of authority to ask the white students not to come to class, where previously it had been an optional thing that the staff never touched, and it was like a cultural thing among the student body. And when Brett voiced his concerns about that, he said, "Oh, well, you're defending white supremacy." And he said, "Well, no, it's just I'm just being consistent." And it seems to me that's what's going on there, where especially by the time when they roped all gamers into what a handful of trolls were doing, it's similar to a point Sam Harris has made, is that when you have to constantly defend yourself against something, you look like you're obsessed with that topic and that you refuse to stop talking about that topic, and it skews the optics. And so now gamers who weren't talking about this thing, they're talking about it now because you've roped them in, and then what they do is they point the finger at gamers, the anti-GamerGaters, I guess you'd call them, and say, "Oh, why are you defending the side that all these alt-right 4chan trolls are on?" But it's like an arranged marriage. They didn't choose to have that association. You put them in that box, and then you blame them for being in the box you put them in. That's what it seems like the anti-GamerGator SJWs have done, and it's similar to what we've seen with the way people in the intellectual dark web have been treated. And it's basically, before Eric Weinstein even mentioned it, it seems like what we have seen with GamerGate, as you described the events, the manifestation of his 4-quadrant model. You're familiar with that, right?
Yes, the political compass.
So the 4-quadrant model. The 4-quadrant model Eric Weinstein had about how SJWs mislead people. I
don't think I've seen that. Sorry.
Okay, so I'll just go over it again. I'm sure most of the listeners know, but imagine like a graph with 4 quadrants. In the top right, you have the very enlightened, tolerant people. All right, so these are people who say and do, we'll say, socially and politically productive things. In the top left, you have people who don't say things that don't say, they'll disagree with what the top right will say, but they have very good motives. So these are the contrarian types. So these are generally speaking people in the IDW. In the bottom right quadrant, you have people who will say the right things, they will virtue signal, but they actually have malicious intentions. So this is what Eric Weinstein calls he says these are the rent-sinking elites. So the mainstream media is a good example where they're just interested in getting their revenues up and having a sellable product, and they will say whatever they can to get those revenues up from advertisers or whatever, and get those hits, get those clicks, and they don't care who they malign in the process. And what they will do is they will try to make the contrarians look like someone who's in the bottom left corner. And bottom left corner is what Eric calls a troglodyte. And a troglodyte is somebody who is an actually detestable person. So the rent-sinking elites try to make it look like they're the really good person in the top right, when actually it's a dupe. And they try to make the contrarians in the top left quadrant look like they're in the bottom right. And the troglodytes say bad things and actually have bad intentions, and contrarians are only saying bad things as a means of offering criticism and basically applying the Socratic method to the platitudes offered by usually the far left. All right, so tolerance doesn't mean actively liking and loving everything about a certain group of people. In fact, you could hate somebody and be very tolerant of them, because all it really means is you put up with them. So things like that. So what we're seeing here is the rent-sinking elites are we'll say the mainstream gaming journalists. They're not really provide. And when we say rent-sinking, Eric basically says in economists vernacular, like that's the biggest put down you can do, because a rent sinker doesn't add value to an economy. They just collect a check from someone else who's producing value, right? Like literally like a rent seeker. But then there are people who engage in similar behavior that's considered rent sinking, even if they're not actually renters. So
yeah, I'm familiar with rent sinking.
Right. So the gaming journalists, or even the mainstream media more broadly, when we look at how they treat people in the IDW, are these rent-seeking elites. And what they do is they try to run hit pieces on people like Jordan Peterson and make them out to be troglodytes, so that they can look like they're, instead of being rent-seeking elites, they're in the top right corner where they're just these pristine individuals. And the people who fall for that are the ones that Eric calls the dupes. So, a good example. So a good example, I think, that connects them is, did you ever see that interview NBC did? Not MSNBC, but NBC, the main station, did on Jordan Peterson about a year ago.
I probably have, but I've seen so many Peterson interviews.
Okay, so it was just like one 90-second thing they put up on there, heavily edited, like to make Jordan Peterson. They call him a member of the alt-right. They actually call him that. Right, that was like an example of such a hit piece by one of the most major media outlets in the world. That is comparable to the same confusion that was it was on August 28th when they released those 10 articles at once. That's the same tactic being employed.
Oh yeah, we've certainly seen a lot of that.
And so both are rent seekers. They're not interested in honest journalism. They're not interested in producing something of actual informative value. They're just trying to get those hits so they can get advertiser money. And they will slander whoever they can, because as far as they're concerned, it helps their bottom line. And they will pretend to be concerned about the issues of the many, as long as it makes them a buck, but they won't do anything meaningful to help it. I mean, a good example is, and this is where it sort of gets, it gets interesting. So, like if you look at, we saw some of this in the 2016 election, for example, right? Obviously, it was used against Donald Trump, and in some of the cases with Donald Trump, of course, the criticisms about him were true. But then there were some things where people just overreacted to what Trump said or deliberately misinterpreted it. So a key example to me is when he said, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue in broad daylight and I wouldn't lose a vote. He wasn't saying he would actually do that. He was actually remarking about how even he was amazed that he wasn't being punished for all the controversial stuff he was saying. That was just Donald Trump even being amazed by it. Because up to that point, he had seen politicians go down for lesser statements, and yet he was saying something that was considered like a super gaffe nearly every day, and his polls numbers just went up. But you also saw it in the Democratic primary against Bernie Sanders, and I think in many ways this is very related. And you also mentioned in your book that a lot of GamerGaters were big supporters of Bernie Sanders. Now, it's also true that some of the people in the anti-GamerGate side were also Bernie supporters, but one thing I think that's interesting to note here is what seemed to turn much of the mainstream media against Bernie in the primary was the fact that he was criticizing the system. You know, he was criticizing, for example, big money in politics. Well, who likes big money in politics? CNN, MSNBC, ABC, all the mainstream media companies, because they get that ad revenue from money in politics. And Bernie says the system's corrupt, it's ruining our democracy, and I'm going to end it. Right? So he's basically he's voicing a broader. I mean, this is talking about American democracy, not just the gaming industry, but he's talking about a lack of ethics and accountability going on in our democratic process. All right, and they spring this attack on him. So what I'm saying in GamerGate is a similar thing. Is that gamers were voicing realistic and valid concerns about ethics and accountability within gaming journalism, and the response to that was to attack the person as being sexist or racist. Bernie got a lot of flack for that in the primary. Oh, well, he can't connect with black voters, or a lot of his voters are sexist Bernie bros. Bernie only attracts white men, and then you see similar statements made about people on the GamerGate side. And that's why I think when you point at in your book the GamerGate event / community, that whole the term as a basket being sort of this predecessor to the intellectual dark web, I do think it's very interesting because there's all these parallels that are they're standing out bright as day. Similar strategies, similar actors, similar motives. For all sides concerned. But this is where it gets interesting to me, because you see, I think, on the side of both the GamerGaters, well, you see among both the GamerGaters and say, how do I put this? It seems like there are progressives and alt-right people who are on the same side in some of these issues. So
well, I'll push back a little bit there. There was almost nobody in the alt-right in GamerGate, right?
Right. Well,
this was if you look at the polling, and also from my own experience, like it was very hard to find even a normal conservative in the movement, right? We would do live streams, we would have conversations. It was very hard to find even like a normal conservative, let alone a Nazi.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so but I guess my observation is that there must have been enough, at least just like from people like on 4chan, who were who had enough notice that they were considered part of the equation. I mean, I generally agree that gamers for the most part are probably not even too political, but it does seem to me that a lot of people are on the alt-right, it seems, because they've been nauseated by the arrogance of behind these accusations and the dishonesty behind them. So there's some of that. But then you have people who you don't end up that way, but they're still very progressive, and but they're also pretty annoyed by that. By like, look, I'm actually support a lot of these things. Why are you saying I'm racist and sexist? And then what ends up happening, I think, with some people is that, and I think this is a big reason why the alt-right exists, is because you tell people that they're racist and sexist and such long enough and you don't give them any peace, eventually they just might start acting like what you say they are. You'll make them into such angry and hateful people that they start acting like angry and hateful people. When they,
yeah, I think that's definitely part of the equation for why the alt-right exists.
Right, and so you also talk about what we can do to move forward. That's been a recent concern, I think, even among people who are fans of the intellectual dark web. All right, like, okay, we talked about Evergreen State College, we talked about Bill C-16, we talked about how Sam Harris was treated over his comments on Islam, and having, and people at least being willing to discuss the topic of things like race and IQ. We've crossed all those, we've marked all those dates off our calendar. What's next? We've got the gang together, right? We've assembled the intellectual dark web. Thank you, Dave Rubin. So what do we do now? Because a lot of people are just sort of tired of saying, well, SJWs suck. What do we do next? What do we do about it? And there's a look to the future that you try to spell out toward the end of your book. I understand it's with more of an eye toward GamerGate, but with GamerGate being a microcosm of the greater culture war, what do you think the way forward is?
Well, I don't think there's really any one particular path, and I sort of outlined this in the last chapter of the book too. There's a lot of different things that probably need to happen.
Okay.
And first of which is the media, right? You talked about the advertising revenue being a big push towards these clickbait articles and things along those lines, right? One thing in that regard that could be done, right, is we can push towards more of a subscription-based model, or even a donations-based model like Patreon or something along those lines, where people are willing to pay for good journalism. I think people are willing to pay for good journalism and willing to pay for hard-hitting articles and critiques. And they're probably less willing to spend their own money to read articles about 10 reasons why Mario is racist, right? They're probably not going to be willing to fork over $5 a month or whatever it happens to be to read that, whereas they would be willing to read an in-depth summary of the tax bill or healthcare or non-biased journalism. So I think we need to encourage and incentivize the journalism model to change so that they're less beholden towards advertisers and advertising revenue, which incentivizes the worst types of behavior. It incentivizes clickbait, incentivizes extremist takes, things that nobody actually believes in. But every time they release one of these articles about why air conditioning is sexist, or why, as the Huffington Post recently did, why white men should stop dating Asian women, they actually wrote an article about that. So when they release these articles, they are creating culture warriors, and they're creating a greater divide in our society. That's part of it, but more fundamental than that, though, I think we need to address, in part, the parenting styles of which how we're raising our children, right? You see Jonathan Haidt talking about this. He wrote a whole book about it, The Coddling of the American Mind. So part of it is that. Part of it is changing our parenting styles and how we can better prepare our children to deal with the real world, where they're not always going to have an authority figure to sort out their issues for them. We're not always going to be protected from every single negative thing in the world, where they're going to have to be exposed to different ideas and different people who they might not always like or agree with. So we have to better prepare our children for the future. And we also have to, there's two more things, I'd say, two more major aspects of this. Or three more, I should say, sorry. I outlined it all in the book. There's three more major aspects to this, too. There's also this ingratitude with Western civilization, right? We always hear about how the West is evil, it's racist, it's sexist, it's a patriarchy, white supremacist society, colonialism, slavery. And obviously there were a lot of negative aspects to Western history, a lot of negative aspects to our own history in the United States. But I think we need to come to terms with the fact that these were part and parcel of every civilization throughout all of human history. And that what makes the West unique is not that we had slavery. It's not that we had racism. It's not that we had colonies. Well, not the United States per se, but other countries that we had these bad things. It's that we overcame these challenges, and that's what Steven Pinker and Jonah Goldberg have been recently written about. How we need to reinstill people with a degree of patriotism, where they're not so pessimistic and hateful towards their own societies anymore. And that drives a lot of this with the social justice warriors, with the far left. This hatred towards the West really is a huge driver behind why they believe what they believe. That's their main belief, right? That is a patriarchy, that it's white supremacist, that the United States has always been evil, right? That the Iraq war was for oil, right? You see these types of critique all over the place from the left. Another aspect to this is how we interact with people ourselves. People like you, people like me, people like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, even just random writers, bloggers, YouTubers, so on and so forth, podcasters. The way we talk to each other is not really ideal. The way we talk, right? You and I, we talk, we sort of dismiss the social justice warriors out of hand. And you see this with, Ben Shapiro, he sort of dismisses the liberal perspectives out of hand, so on and so forth. And we talk to our own audiences and we talk to each other. We're not really going in depth and presenting their arguments in a way that they would agree is fair, for one. And two, we're not trying to convince people. We're talking to our own audience. We're trying to throw red meat out there to our bases. And I've done this too with my own YouTube channel. I've tried to move away with it over the past year and a half or so. But I used to do the same thing, right? I'm making an article about the social justice warriors X, the social justice warriors Y. They're blah blah blah. You're never going to convince anybody by doing that. You're going to have to dig in deep. You're going to have to do your homework, do the reading, right, to understand what it is that they truly believe, and then try to argue against that, but not in a you're an idiot way, but in a here's why that's wrong. Here's why I disagree way, where you can actually have conversations and form the basis of a conversation to actually convince people that their ideas are bad. And that's for the left and the right. Like, everybody should start doing this rather than just playing to the base, which is a very easy thing to do. And I guess the final aspect of it is we have to fix the culture itself. And this is the hardest aspect, and I don't necessarily know how to go about this, but we have to instill people with a sense of value and meaning and purpose in life. And I think a lot of the problems we're seeing today, from the alt-right to the social justice warriors to the opioid epidemic, are all, at least in part, caused by this lack of purpose, lack of meaning in society, where people are struggling, not even necessarily financially, right? They could have all the money in the world and they'd still be unhappy. They'll still be unsatisfied with life. We have to find a way to instill people with that sense of value and purpose. And, in the past, we used to do this through religion, for instance. But now, as religion is declining, we have to find some way to replace that. And if you don't replace that sense of purpose and community with positive things, right? Such as a civic nationalism, right? A nationalism that is based on values and ideas, not based on skin color, or based it around human values, humanism, or based it around religion, or based it around a common culture, or anything positive. If we don't do that, then what's going to happen is these grifters on the far right and the far left are going to take advantage of that and take advantage of these broken and lost people. And they're going to say, hey, we've got all the answers over here. Come join the alt-right. Come join the social justice movement, right? And they're going to take advantage of these people, and they're going to brainwash them, and they're going to destroy our society.
Right. Well, you really touched on a lot there, but I think I will focus on first. I want to talk about what I think is a good point, but it's also one that seems very hard to overcome, which is you talked about how we need to be able to talk to each other. So we dismiss social justice warriors out of hand, like you said, but we do need to get to a point where we can actually talk with those folks, and that I agree that's a desirable end state for getting where we need to get. But it strikes me as extremely difficult, just because there is so much unwillingness, I feel, we'll say among SJWs, to ascribe the benefit of the doubt to somebody who has differing views, that you can almost not even start with them if you try. And it is really hard to know what you can say, or if you knew what to say, how you can say it, that you can establish some kind of rapport to get things going. That seems to me to be one of the major challenges, because there are so many, like for me, for example, okay, I'm a white man. That fact alone makes me irredeemable in the eyes of so many of these SJWs. That it is impossible for me to make any headway with them. And we kind of saw that with Brett Weinstein over the Evergreen State College Dave Absence fiasco, where people were protesting, and he was all like, "Okay, what's going on? Tell me your problems." Like, he very open, right? True to who he is. That's how he tackled it. And they came there with a mission. And there's that old saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy, right? If you're a smart person trying to accomplish your mission, they didn't go in with that mindset. They were going to finish their plan the way they did it, regardless of what they learned. And meeting Brett Weinstein and seeing this very open, curious guy did not matter to them. And that to me seems to be a very big hurdle. We can certainly do better on our side, but it's like the losing solution to the prisoner's dilemma, where you give them the benefit of the doubt and they don't give it to you. I'm a little lost on how to navigate that myself.
Well, I think you're right. It's a lot of these hardcore people you're not going to convince, and they're probably always going to be with us. In fact, I did a video recently on my channel about how these types of people, this type of mindset has always been with us, right? It's taken different names, and it's manifested itself in different ways. But this mindset of wanting to control the other, wanting to control what other people do, is part and parcel of probably human nature, right? There's always going to be some percentage of people who hold this view. And in the past, that was evangelical Christians, right? They're very upset about gay marriage. They're very upset about abortion. They're very upset about Dungeons and Dragons and video games, right? We saw this too, like, oh, it's satanic panic. You saw it with weed. You saw it with going back decades. You saw it with witch trials, right? These women aren't acting the stereotypical way they should. We should burn them at the stake. So you saw this sort of mindset and this mentality all throughout human history. And people like that are probably always going to be with us. But what we can do, right, is we can probably not convince most of them to change their minds. But what we can do is we can convince the other people, the people who are maybe a little bit on the fence, maybe leaning towards that direction a certain way, leaning towards that community, leaning towards those ideas. And by talking about these topics in a nuanced way and talking about them in an honest way rather than just insulting people, we can begin to shift those people more into a moderate camp, more into adopting or refusing to adopt the extremist ideas. And these people who are extremists, right? We've had neo-Nazis in our society, the Ku Klux Klan. We've had different groups like that on the far right for decades, right? They still exist to this day. Their ideology was defeated in 1945, yet they still cling on. We have communists today, right? Their ideology was defeated in 1991. They still cling on today, right? There's always going to be crazies and extremists out there. The Westboro Baptist Church. But as long as they are relatively small in number, it doesn't really matter. What we need to do is convince more people to not adopt those ideas.
Right, well, it seems to me that one thing that might be a little bit different in this context is it seems to me that these crazies among the SJWs have much bigger megaphones and much larger access and even control of the conduits of how information is spread today. Because again, they they have a lot of, they're behind a lot of the key stuff within the mainstream media. Right, they're the ones with the publications and the resources to manipulate things that way. And what we see on the right, though smaller, isn't much better. But that's sort of how it is. It's that we seem to have a problem where it's difficult to magnify the voices of, we'll say, temperate people, because for whatever reason, those are not the people with the reins of the media and of what we're using to get our information out generally. That seems to be a bit of a unique thing, right? Westboro Baptist Church can do something to make the news, but they don't have much influence or control over MSNBC, for example.
Right, that's true. It's different because they have power.
Whereas, one activist can stir up a Twitter outrage mob like nothing before and get all of these major journalists and reporters to side with them, almost with the snap of a finger. It's amazing how much influence SJWs have in this compared to previous fringe groups throughout history.
Well, it's easy. There's this quote from Star Trek: The Next Generation. He who clothes himself. Villains who twirl their mustaches are easy to spot. Those who clothe themselves in good deeds are living among us, or something along those lines. It's actually a really cool quote from John Luke.
Okay. Yeah, so but that's one problem I see. And then, of course, and this gets to the other point you were making where, and I'll talk about this a bit, is it leads to really bogus articles like 10 reasons why Mario is racist and sexist. And yeah, that's something a lot of people don't want to read, but that's rather often what we're seeing. And it goes to, like you said, this hatred, this self-hatred within the West, where we think that the West is somehow unique in its history of patriarchal values, as if that's not at work in the Middle East under Islam, rather often Sharia Islam. Apparently, that's not patriarchy. And then even if you just look at less extreme forms, you look at Eastern Asia and you look at the influence of Confucianism, which is still a major part of Eastern Asian culture today. Very patriarchal, but doesn't matter apparently. And you're right that the West is the exception in that we've really largely overcome a lot of these same societal flaws in ways that other regions either did later or just haven't quite done as well or at all. And that seems to be missing from it. But and instead you see a lot of stuff like, well, here's 10 reasons why Mario's racist. And the real confusion to me is like, okay, here's an example that jumps out to me, just about why these games aren't supporting, like, we'll say, like why they're not supporting, like the common complaint is like too many white video game characters, right? That's one thing. Well, for one, that's crazy because a significant amount of video games come from Japan, and their characters tend to look Japanese, so that's weird. But if you look at something that has more of a Western origin, a very major title where you play a Middle Eastern brown dude, Assassin's Creed. I loved that game when it came out. Great game, hugely influential. So did a lot of other people. So did a lot of these people that were later called, racist within the context of GamerGate. And that's, that seems strange to me. It's like there are so many exceptions within the history of gaming to the very narrow window they've tried to paint this with. Like, sure, Mario rescues Peach. That's a very dated narrative framing. It's not original. And it could be said to say like, oh, this is, you could maybe describe that as patriarchal if you want to. But then there are other exceptions, like Samus is a woman who fights a bunch of aliens and doesn't need any rescuing, and she's been around about as long as Mario has. Where it is Mario a case of everything why the West is wrong, but Samus just doesn't count within the context of gaming? Those are things.
Also, it's like their idea, the anti-GamerGate community, right? It's cultivation theory, right? So Mario in and of itself, right? Well, a man rescuing a woman is not inherently sexist, right? There's nothing inherently sexist about that. I think you would probably agree, right?
Right.
Just as it's not inherently sexist for a woman to rescue a man or a white person to rescue a black person or vice versa, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing inherent, like Die Hard, right? You have a black cop who saves Bruce Willis at the very end. So, there's nothing inherently racist about that, nothing inherently sexist about that. But they see it as a combination of things. They see it as, and there's some truth in this, right? It starts with a kernel of truth, right? In that human beings are the sum of their experiences in many cases, plus genetics. So you go throughout your day, you drive to work, you're at work, you have a bad encounter with a coworker, and you come home, you play Grand Theft Auto, right? They use the word cunt in Grand Theft Auto, right? There's the hot coffee mod, right? There's prostitution, right? It's like, okay, that in and of itself, nothing wrong with that. You go to work tomorrow, do the same thing. You have a good experience this time with your coworker, whatever, right? So on and so forth. You play Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball, so on and so forth. And over the course of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of days, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of months, you will eventually begin to internalize what you've seen. So now you expect women in real life to be prostitutes if you give them money, right? Because that's what they do in Grand Theft Auto, right? You pay the hooker and she gives you a blowjob, right? And, or whatever it happens to be. And so they sort of have this idea where over time, your experiences with all these different media, video games, movies, television shows, books, also your real life experiences from family interactions, work interactions, so on and so forth, they all contribute to you becoming a worse person in real life or holding retrograde views about women, for instance, in real life. And there's like a kernel of truth in that because, of course, you can take messages from things, right? You could, and I've used this example before, but you could be driving to work and you see a dead deer on the side of the road, right? And now you think to yourself, wow, I guess the lives of deer aren't really that important. And so you think, I guess I can go hunting next week, right? They're going to die either way, whether they're hit by a car or die from natural causes or eaten by an alligator. So there's nothing wrong with me hunting it, right? And so that you're less willing to be repulsed by hunting. Or you might look at that and be like, wow, human civilization is so cruel to nature, right? We built these roads where these deer live, and now the deer are dying. It's horrible, right? You could take any number of things away from that situation. Or you could just say, I don't care, one way or the other. I'm just going to go about my day. So it's entirely possible that you could take a message from something, and a lot of good media does have messages in it, right? George Orwell. Certainly nobody would claim that 1984 is apolitical. Or one of my favorite anime, Psychopaths, where it's basically a critique of the Chinese social credit system, right? Very political themes, also very good works. But in a free society, people are free to make these video games, free to make these movies and pictures and so on and so forth. And they're free to put these ideas out there. And I think on the whole, your vast majority of people are going to gain more of their experiences in life through real life interactions, through their real life experiences, and through looking at the data on particular topics than they are to say, well, you murdered somebody, a woman in Grand Theft Auto, therefore murdering women is okay, right? Or women are less human, right? I think that's really a stretch, especially since the vast majority of media that exists does not reinforce that idea, does not reinforce that narrative, right? The vast majority of media does not show that murdering women is acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Right. I agree. And then it seems to me like some of the complaints there is just that, Well, okay, you look at something like prostitution in Grand Theft Auto. Often that's what things like that are just sort of a consequence of an immersive experience, right? You kind of want the game to feel like you're in the story, right? So like, well, what are some things that actually happen? You know, people get
right, and they're also edgy
right?
games, right? Grand Theft
Yeah,
Auto, they purposely push the boundaries a little bit.
right. So there's that. So yeah, it's kind of the point there is that it's different. There's something not quite right about it, and that's what makes it interesting. But truth be told, that's at the that's pretty much behind everything with the narrative. Certainly, something is not quite right, and you're going to find out about what's going to be done about it. Right, and so like fundamentally, what's not quite right about any Mario game is that the princess has been captured, and you can say it's a reinforcement of, I don't know, patriarchy or male entitlement when Mario saves her. Or you could say it's a good story of like, well, when somebody is in need of help, you should help them. Like there was this story about 2-3 years ago where this girl was being abducted by a guy from her yard, and the neighbor across the street saw it happen, and he immediately hopped in his car and pursued the guy and like called the police and didn't let him get away, and they were able to rescue the girl. But you know, we know what happens when a little girl is kidnapped and thrown in a car like that, and they speed off. That it's a very dark end in store for her.
Oh yeah,
You know, whether she lives a lot, whether she is kept in some sort of dungeon afterwards or dies shortly after, it's going to be pure misery. Now
yeah, we actually experienced. Sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, that's what I was going to say. Now this guy, for all we know, he was. If you want to use the anti-GamerGator logic as I'm trying to like guess what it would be, you could say just as well he was influenced by Mario to go rescue a person who'd been kidnapped. And
well, they would. So I don't want to strawman them, right?
Yeah.
They would not say that Mario in and of itself encouraged him to commit this crime, right?
Okay.
They would. They're smart enough to realize that's a dumb argument. What they would say is that our society broadly, right? So all the entertainment that exists, Mario, Grand Theft Auto, what's another movie that has the Taken movies, right?
Mhm.
All these movies reinforce this idea, and that over the course of your life, you're going to experience all of these different things, and the culmination of all of those little tiny nudges, like Mario makes you 0.0001% more sexist. The next thing does the same thing. The next thing does the same thing. Next thing does the same thing, right? They would say that it's a cumulative effect, just to avoid straw manning them.
Or steel manning them.
To steel man them, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is that while you could, they seem to be focused on the way. If we assume it's actually guiding our behavior, it seems to me that's just equally true that there's stuff in media content that they criticize that also gears us toward good. The fact is, in most video games, you play the good guy. That's just how it's tended to be and how it'll always be. So the net effect of games is people have traditionally played and enjoyed them. You're the good guy, and being good to other people is eminently desirable. So the idea that there's this culture among gamers that is somehow running in the opposite direction overall, whether it's in the context of racism or sexism, just seems a bit odd to me. And then there are things that they don't seem to bother arguing with, but why not? Like, nobody seems to care that, I don't know, often in these games it's a princess, whether you save the princess or not. I mean, I think even a lot of people in the anti-GamerGator thing would say, well, are the Mario and Zelda games anti-democratic? Why is the Mario?
Right. Because, well, let's use an even stronger example, right? This is something that Rob Fahey, I think it was Rob Fahey anyway, he's an anti-GamerGate journalist. He wrote a huge piece. I did a full critique of it on my channel, actually. It's The Sin of Mainstream Video Games. He talks about war, right? All these video games, you play the good guy, right? You play the American or British soldier who's fighting against the Nazis, or use even a more contemporary example, you're fighting in Afghanistan, right?
Mm-hmm.
So his argument is that because you're playing as an American soldier or a British soldier or French soldier or so on and so forth, you're adhering to the notion. The games are promoting the notion that in Afghanistan the Americans are the good guys, right? And I think most of us would probably agree that the Americans are the good guys in Afghanistan. But
Yeah.
his argument is that it's promoting the idea that, like, right, we're fighting to save these people. We're fighting to promote freedom in Afghanistan. We're fighting against the Taliban, who are evil, right? And that might not be that's promoting American imperialism, right? It's promoting this idea that America is the good guy, that Britain's the good guy, and that we're rescuing the savages of Afghanistan from their worst elements.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I can see that. It just seems to me that, like, the Taliban are so obviously bad. I mean, they're basically ISIS before there was ISIS.
They were ISIS that made it, to quote Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems weird to me that you'd feel sympathy within that context.
But if you're a leftist, right? Let's say you're Noam Chomsky.
Mm-hmm.
You view the United States as having consistently and always having engaged in very negative actions abroad. And there is some truth in this, right? We've certainly made mistakes. I would certainly say.
Oh, I agree completely.
Yeah, we've certainly made mistakes, and we've certainly done things that were immoral. However, on the whole, I'd say we've done a lot more good than harm, and I think the data bears that out. But if you're Noam Chomsky, right, you see this, you see it as reinforcing the idea that why does America and Afghanistan? Why does America have the right to invade Afghanistan? Why does America have the right to bomb Afghanistan? Why does America have the right to fight the Taliban? If the Taliban want to rule the country and the people aren't going to rise up against the Taliban, or if they do and they fail, then hey, that's just the state of things, right? That's the state of nature. That's the Taliban enforcing their will on the population, and the population is at least okay enough with it that they don't overthrow the Taliban. That's self-determination. If they want to live like that, if they want to put women in burqas, if they want to stone them to death for alleged adultery, right, and so on and so forth, they want to kill homosexuals, right? That's their right as a people to decide that for themselves. Who is America to come in and say you can't do that?
Well, here's the ironic thing. In most cases, you think it would be the same leftists, like the same leftists who complain about racism, sexism, homophobia. When you look at pretty much everything bad the Taliban does, it's based on those three things. I mean, they turn women into cattle. They've done ethnic cleansing of the non-Pashtuns, and of course they don't have particularly unique attitudes toward homosexuals within the Muslim world. And then that's just the ironic thing. But then it even seems like there are always so many major exceptions to that sort of that perception. So if we go back to, like, say, the popularity of war games, right? Let's look at Call of Duty, for example. You play as the Americans or the British, and normally they're the unequivocal good guys within the context of, like, the World War II titles, because and maybe there's less concern about that with the leftist types, just because, I mean, you're literally killing Nazis in those.
Right.
So maybe that's the one area where we can find agreement. There are other Call of Duty titles. So there's the Modern Warfare series. In the first one, it does seem like a more traditional thing where America and Britain are the good guys, and the Middle Easterners and the Russians are the bad guys. There's a hint at some nuance to it, right? The main menu screen starts with Zakhaev saying, our so-called leaders prostituted us to the West, destroyed our cultures, our economy, our honor. There's a notion there, at least within the bad guy's point of view, that he thinks he's the good guy because he thinks the West ruined his country.
Right.
And when you see the subtitles of Assad's speech when he murders Al-Fulani in the opening sequence of Call of Duty 4, talks again about how, he says the Saudi monarchy, just sold us out to the West and misused us. and that ends once and for all. We're not going through that again. And so there's sprinkles of that. You see it even more clearly in the following games, particularly Modern Warfare 2. With
Modern Warfare 2 is
Shepard,
definitely not
right, and then right, like that. Shepard is like he's the embodiment of crooked American imperialism in that. You know, orchestrates a war just so he can give America justification to strike back and increase its dominance in the world. And you see, you know, with among the Russians there are, well, it's even Gas says this in Call of Duty 4. He's like, so are these good Russians or the bad Russians? Talking about the loyalists and between the ultranationalists, and you see heroic Russian characters throughout that. So there is some, you know, there's some nuance to it, and then that's sort of like, there are so many games where that is the case, where the I guess the side that they're saying is always stereotyped to be bad is being shown in positive lights, and then the Western side is shown like, here are its faults, and it's organically worked in. Like, part of, I think, why the Modern Warfare games are popular, it's not just because Call of Duty 4 really evolved the genre in terms of the mechanics and stuff, but because, you know, within something like its campaign, there was just, it seemed like it felt real, and it didn't feel like it was trying to be preachy to you. It was resonant without insulting its base. And it seems like the weird thing about what seems to be with a lot of the approach of the culture wars thing is that they don't seem to know how to be real and organic and maybe put a message in their game without insulting their consumer base.
That's a huge issue with it. I don't mind. I would be more than willing to defend, that I have defended, supposedly social justice games, right? The way I see it, there's a market for all different types of games to be made. And, you know, the market should decide what is successful, what is not.
Yeah, I think a good example of that is BioShock Infinite, where, you know, it's basically you get to take down the white supremacists of Colombia. That seems like a social justice game, if you ask me, in that way. But it didn't feel like they were. It's not like they were trying to say, "Oh, this is you guys, by the way. Enjoy, you know, killing you." But it seems like there's a tendency to want to work it in that direction now. Like the announcement that, oh, well, we need to make our games like this, because we think there's something wrong with our customers, is just, I don't understand. I mean, could you maybe go? I know that you've sort of touched on it.
Well, it's just bad writing.
You think it's as simple as that? It's bad writing, and
it's they have this desire, right? When you create these narratives, right? There's a good way to do it, right? There's a way to do it where you're promoting an idea and a message, right? But you're doing it in a nuanced way. You're doing it in a way where you aren't being disrespectful to people who disagree with you. And there's also doing it in a way where you're extremely ham-fisted about it, and that's just bad writing. It's horrible writing. It doesn't make for a good product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a very salient example of that recently is the second Lego movie. Have you seen that?
I have not.
Okay, well, I would say
I never saw the first one.
Okay, well, the first one's good. But here's interesting is both movies feature what I think you could consider to be leftist, left-leaning, left-favoring, however you want to describe it, messages. So the first Lego movie is basically, the thing to understand about the Lego movies is there's an inner story and an outer story. So the inner story is what's happening in the Lego world, and it's like a manifestation, an imagined manifestation of what's happening in the outer world. So in the first one, there's this kid, and he's playing with his Legos in the basement, and his problem is his father's a businessman, and he's like always away, and he's always kind of distant, and when he is around, he's kind of mean and stingy. So that manifests in the real world, where all the good Lego characters are up against this guy named President Business. Right? Now, that name alone gives you an idea of what kind of points they're trying to make in this movie, right? And then there's another line like where he goes to a cafe, and it's like, he's like, $30 for a cup of coffee? that sounds great. But, he pauses for a minute, like, $30 for a cup of coffee? Kind of making a jab at, like, companies like Starbucks and stuff. And so, and so there's basically, there's a line where, like, the business that President Business runs also is the manufacturer of the voting machines there, right? So, okay, we see what's going on, right? So there's some somewhat hyperbolic but pointed criticisms of things that are wrong in America that you tend to hear more often from the left, not so much from the right. So there's that. But it didn't really, there's something true about it, but I think fundamentally what's interesting about that is these are criticisms of elites and not of people who might enjoy it. Like, in particular, this is the Lego movie. Who do you think tended to play with Legos growing up? Boys or girls?
Fucking everybody. Oh,
Yeah.
Boys, yeah.
But like, if you had to flip a coin and say, was it boys or girls mainly playing? It was boys, right? And even if girls played a little bit, boys probably play with them more often. Like, I play with Legos a bunch. My twin sister, not so much. I don't know if she ever touched a Lego, to be honest. It's not a great sample size, but it's sort of a living example there. Second Lego movie is very different. It's about how the boy wants to just sort of be kept alone with his Legos. His little sister wants to play with him. So that's the outer story. It manifests in the Lego characters in the boys' world being abducted by the Lego characters in the girls' Lego world, and then they have to go on a mission to rescue them. And then basically, it starts out making it look like the girls' Lego characters are the bad guys because, they kidnapped them. And in fact, that the queen of the girls' Lego world even tries to get Lego Batman. She's trying to coerce him into marriage so they can unite their worlds, basically, right? And then what you find out at the end, the twist is that, actually, the girls' Lego characters are the good guys. Why? Oh, we just wanted to hang out with you. And it's like, and again, because that's what the girl is. She just wants to play with her older brother, and he kind of wants to just be left alone and do his own thing, right? Now, reverse the roles in that. Imagine a king abducts a woman to coerce her into marriage, and his argument is just, I just want to be with you.
Right.
I mean, it falls flat on its face. And then what ends up happening in the outer story is the brother goes to his sister's room to get his Legos back. He smashes some of the stuff she had in the process. Their mom comes in, and she's like, all right, this is the last time. For the last 5 years, you guys have been fighting and doing all this. And in fact, that's the case. You get there after 5 years where the sister has routinely gone up there and stolen some of his Legos because he won't play with her. And the mom's response is just like, arguing bad, both sides are at fault, put out the fire. And when the boy, he was always minding his own business. And when his mom wouldn't do anything about it, he stands up for himself. And he's actually depicted as the bad guy in the outer story. And then he finally says, you just wanted to play with me? Okay. And that's really it. It's that ham-fisted, to use the word you just used. And the boy who minded his own business and wanted to be left to do his own thing was bad for doing that. And it just that seemed like a story where it's like they went from criticizing the elite to criticizing the people who were likely watching that movie. And the writing was so much worse for it. Like, the first Lego movie is hilarious. So many great jokes. You're laughing the whole time. It's like none of the jokes really land in the Lego movie 2. And I can't help but wonder if that's just the product of the fact that they were so focused on squeezing their narrative into the script that seems to be the concern about what's going on with gaming as it pertains to GamerGate.
Well, I want to touch back on something, if you don't mind,
Okay.
you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
Not Metal Gear Solid. Modern Warfare, right? So you talked about how, like, they do show some nuance here. They do show a little bit of both sides, how one side's not perfect. Mm-hmm. But I think most, or at least some of the people in that camp, people like Rob Fahey, Anita Sarkeesian, and so on, they would probably concede that to steelman them. But at the end of the day, right, the product is still a fun product. And like, this is obviously, it almost has to be a fun product, right? because otherwise we're not going to get people to buy it. But by portraying it as fun, right? By having you go in there and shooting up the Taliban, by having you go in there and blowing up ISIS or what have you, you're still portraying this killing, this action, this on behalf of America, as a fun, exciting experience, and that this doesn't quite do justice to the nuances, right? Because your story, like Metal Gear Solid, right? Very nuanced anti-war story, actually. There's a lot of anti-war themes in Metal Gear Solid. But it's still a fun game, and you're having fun killing people. So it seems like they would argue, and I've seen many of them argue, well, this is some of the smarter ones have argued, I should say, that it's there's something wrong, right? When you're having fun doing something that the game tells you is bad, it's mismatching the story with the actions. And that there's just something you can't really overcome in gaming. Whereas, like in a movie, there's not an interactive component to it. But with a video game, if the game is telling you killing is wrong, the game is telling you that war is bad, yet you're a soldier, then you are still having fun doing the bad thing. And that's a disconnect between what the story is trying to tell you.
Well, it seems to me at that point, if that's their problem, that they don't want games to be retooled to have, I don't know, to give different impressions on the players. It seems to me that they're just, at that point, against video games at their most fundamental, because you basically just have to cut out so many video games, so many genres even, from existence to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and I mean, you could, I guess, theoretically.
I mean, basically, the shooter genre has to die. The shooter genre has to die at that point.
I mean, you could almost make a game where you have like every fucking option available, right? So you're in the game. You could join the Taliban in the game. You could stay with the army. You could say fuck it and become a deserter and go live in a village or something. You know, you could have like all these different, or like try to have every single conflict in the game be solved peacefully, having a peaceful option. But I don't think that would work. Like, if every single bad guy in the Modern Warfare campaign, you had the option to sit down with him and convince him that radicalism is wrong, like it wouldn't work.
That would be a very resource-intensive game too. You'd have to put so many outs and possibilities in there that the budget would be so high. Because again, you'd have to put in because when people play the game, right, they have all these options, and that would make it cool, yes, but with all that breadth to it, the player's only going to be playing like 10% of that breadth. They're not going to try.
Right.
Most people aren't going to try everything, right? So,
well, it would have replay value at least.
Yeah, it would have some replay value, but really, it's for them. They're going to get about as much out of it for as any old $60 game, right? And it sounds like if it's going to be that expansive, this sounds like it's like $120, $150 game just to cover costs. And you don't want to dump.
It would almost. I could almost think that something else would be cool. Like, obviously, it wouldn't really work in like something like Modern Warfare. There's like 15 enemies around you, and you're like, "Stop! Nobody shoot! Nobody shoot! Nobody shoot!" I'm going to walk up one at a time, talk to each of you. You know, like that wouldn't work. But like, if I could almost see there being something cool about having a game like, let's say you're playing as an interrogator for like the U.S. Army. You've captured soldiers, right, or Taliban or whoever. And you're interrogating them, like you learn about their life story, and you try and figure out like what are they lying about, what are they not.
Yeah, well,
that could be probably.
It seems to me like the only thing we could do that could really accomplish that is have some sort of like virtual reality kind of thing, like something. This isn't very many people's favorite example, but something like Sword Art Online, where the human inclusion and therefore the variability that effectively human characters at that point create in the game allow you the kind of breadth that you'd want. But because that's a lot to program. You talk about, to a certain point, it almost sounds like you're making actual AIs to make the game.
Yeah, you'd almost have to, like the Star Trek holodecks, maybe not pure AI, but like something like that, where it's able to adapt and respond to a different situation, different stimuli.
Right, and at that point, it's just like, it sounds like it would be a lot easier just to create some sort of virtual world kind of MMO kind of game or whatever, and basically let the human players take on that role, and that's kind of, you could kind of say that's the plot of that show Sword Art Online, where you see that unfold, that people resolve things violently or peacefully. But I think one thing that's also missing, and this goes to something Jordan Peterson says a lot, and this is missing. When I say missing, I'm talking about from the anti-GamerGater side. He points out that a lot of what people say is socially constructed or cultivated or conditioned isn't necessarily so, and it's just these are the things we happen to like, just the way our genes are. And unless you start radically changing the human genome, this is what we enjoy. And life is short. Why can't we just enjoy our stuff? Like the fact that, for one, video gaming tends to be a largely male hobby. The more of your regular gamers are male than female. And while there have always been some female gamers, while my sister didn't play Legos with me, really, we both did play Super Mario Brothers on the NES. And we've played, we both played Pokemon, both played Kingdom Hearts. I mean, we both been pretty active gamers, and she's still something of a gamer. Now there are some games that I play that she doesn't. Like I've played Call of Duty games. I don't know if she's ever touched Call of Duty. But for the most part, we're looking at a male gamer base. And you're probably going to see a lot of games that will be more interesting than men. It seems to me that a lot of this isn't so much trying to, or even accidentally conditioning, we'll say toxic male behaviors, but it's just, for most of gaming history, developers have known their audience, and they've made games that will be entertaining to their audience. Right? If most of your players are men, story about a guy who goes and saves a princess is probably going to be more interesting. And then again, that's sort of going to like, well, what sells? And then it seems to me like trying to pretend that your customer base is 50% male, 50% female, when realistically it's just not. And then,
well, it probably never will be. Like as you said, there's these differences between men and women, and obviously if a woman wants to play Call of Duty, more power to her. Right? No one should try and stop her. But naturally, certain games are going to appeal to certain people more often than the other types of games.
And among the women I know who do play the kind of games I'm more likely to play than, say, my sister is likely to play, among those women, I don't think I've ever heard a single complaint that you hear from a lot of these feminists within gaming journalism who are on the anti-GamerGater side of things. Like, I don't think I've ever heard a complaint that the combatants in war games are pretty much always male. And there's this idea that a lot of people are upset about that. I'm like, well, who exactly? Like, is it really enough that you want to say the tendency of the characters to be male is some, I don't know, sexist conspiracy or something? It seems to me like most people don't care. In the same way that I didn't care that Altair in Assassin's Creed was a Middle Easterner and not a white European. The game was good. I didn't.
Well, that's what most people want. They just want a good game, right?
Yeah, it didn't matter to me that Altair was from a different culture. I mean, if anything, they make the white people look bad in that game. Look at the Templars; they're jackasses. I mean, it's like one of the tasks in the game is to kill all the Templars, all the Templar Knights that you meet. Right? It's like, I don't look at that and say, oh, this game's about killing the white people there. I mean, it's just strange that I don't worry about, and maybe there's good reasons why I don't worry about that, because I'm not in a daily cultural environment where I have to worry about that kind of thing. It's not like I can't be reminded of something that's not happened, right? Whereas, the minstrel show is a reminder of something that was going on if you're black. But even then, it's like, I can look at that and assume that there's good faith, and there are several contexts where it does go when the situation is reversed, it does go the other way. Like Mario rescuing Peach, there's really nothing. I don't think there's nothing malevolent toward women behind that. It's just dude rescues a princess is a pretty common idea. I mean, people, men and women, have told these types of stories for centuries. I mean, it's not just men who have appreciated these stories; it is women rather often who have appreciated these stories, and it's not because they've internalized hatred of themselves. I don't think. I mean, one thing that's interesting to me is that, like, you could even say Zelda is another example where a dude goes and saves a princess, right? But Legend of Zelda seems to be among the gamers who are female. It seems to be very popular with them, more so than say Mario or even Samus. And it's not clear to me why that is, but maybe there's something about the Zelda character where she's a little bit more, I guess, refined and maybe mature than what you see in Peach. Peach is kind of they've really made Peach into kind of a stereotype in some ways. I'll admit, as they've developed her. You know, Peach is very prissy. Zelda is sometimes, but sometimes she's not, depending on which incarnation you're talking about. But there's this, there's this weird, and again, I guess it goes back to that sort of prisoner's dilemma where you have people like me who can look at my side being portrayed as the bad guy. If you want to say it's my side, if you want to say the Templars are my side, all right, just because there are certain similarities. The fact that we're both of European descent, I guess, or from the West, I guess, is that I can look at that and I can say, look, it's a good game. It is a good game. And it seems to me like is that really what the heart of this is? It's just that if games are good, if it's an enjoyable experience, if you can go and say, wow, that was a good game, what's wrong with that? Is that
That's
what
I feel it should be.
Right, and is that what this all? That's what this all comes. That's really what maybe the nucleus of this is, at least for the people on the GamerGator side, is that like, what's wrong with games just being good, and why do we have to inject any kind of ideology into it?
Well, I wouldn't even say that. I'd say that it's more people should be free to create the works that they want, and people should be free to buy those works, so that developers can create a political game or a non-political game and let people decide what they want to buy.
Okay. So what do you think the way forward is? And this is going to be a narrower question than what I asked before. What do you think the way forward is such that you can get a game that's more like what the critics of GamerGate want, where it's more inclusive or diverse or whatever, but it's not coming at the cost of, say, quality, or it's not trying to deride its own consumer base? I mean, how do we reach that end state? Because that seems to me like something we need to be able to do, I think, to bridge this gap a bit.
Well, in regards to gaming, I don't really think there's anything to do except act as a consumer, which is to buy the products that interest you, that you think are going to be good, that you've seen people review or play on YouTube or what have you, and support the products that you like. And if a game is overly ham-fisted, right, or it's just bad, don't support the developer, don't support that product. So I think it's the best way forward is just to let the market sort itself out, because ultimately these companies don't care about politics one way or the other. They care about green, making a profit.
Yeah, and maybe that's one thing we need to, I think, really make people more keenly aware of, is that I think a lot of this has gotten where it's gotten is because some people have really been fooled into thinking that these companies actually do have specific values or a specific political agenda that they want to help these things. And it's not that. I think they have some sort of calculus, and whatever that is, they've come to the conclusion that they'll be better off trying to be more inclusive or diverse and ham-fisted or whatever word you want to use. I think we need to make people more aware of, like, as soon as they don't think they're going to make money from it, they'll turn on you. And I think that's one thing that might be useful to contribute to the discussion is, there's nothing wrong with what you want in gaming, but these people are not your friends. And, next day, these people that you've empowered and supported could do very bad things with the goodwill that's been built up around them. Again, going back to what you said, the enemy who's been dressed up in good deeds and is around you is harder to spot than the one who's curling his mustache.
Right.
And I see that. I think that's a lot of what's going on, because a lot of people will say, "Oh, they're trying to make games more progressive." I don't think that's the case, because, I mean, again, if we're talking about just what is easier for a corporation, very often it's not progressive. If you want to talk about like progressive business practices, I always say look at how they treat their workers. Do they pay them well enough that they basically have a living wage? Do they give them a stake in the company, right? Do they have like stock options, stuff like that? Do they have paid parental leave? You're getting into stuff like that, I think. If you're going to talk about a company being progressive, you're talking about specifically its business model, especially with a focus to labor. But you're talking about...
most conservatives would probably be like, yeah, that's good. They'd want to work for a company that has stock options, for instance.
Yeah, right. And the idea that, because it goes into the idea that you're just being rewarded for hard work. What's wrong with that? Right? And again, this is why I often say you don't have to be progressive at the cost of being conservative necessarily. And what's interesting is, again, if we look back at the 2016 election, these same basic people and these same tactics were used to try and stop the progressive candidate in the Democratic primary. So when I look at like people saying, "Oh, they're trying to make gays more progressive," I'm like, this is the same stunt they pulled to stop progressivism. So it's clearly something else. And I think a lot of people, but like going back to Eric Weinstein's quote, I don't know, a lot of people are being duped. I think maybe one thing if we're going to do something, if there's one thing we can do so we can talk more to each other, perhaps the thing to do is to point out to folks that actually, you know what, we really want to see a lot of the same problems solved, and these people aren't your friends. They're going to turn on you one day when it's convenient. And I don't think that's like, a particularly paranoid thing to do. I just think that's how companies rather often are, especially when they're in a particularly in a country that doesn't regulate them very, very well. They do what they can get away with, and they change loyalties as soon as it's convenient for them. And I think that's the direction that we're going. I mean, and I think this is kind of true of just leftist identitarian politics in general. And Brett Weinstein has made this point as well, as right now we're seeing with a lot of racial minorities here in America, there's sort of a political coalition forming among them, right? Where African Americans and Latin folk and Native Americans and pretty much all the non-white minorities are kind of in this. Well, a lot of left-wing identity politics forms around this coalition of these groups, you could say, or at least those among the groups who are in on that mindset, right? But as soon as they reach a point where they're sufficiently powerful, however powerful they end up becoming or want to become, and as soon as they don't need each other anymore, they'll probably turn on each other, right? The bubble will burst, and
they aren't forming a coalition based on common values. They're forming a coalition based on, hey, you look like me, or you're not white.
Right. So that's
not a lasting basis for
right.
politics.
There's a very shallow pretense of common values, right? Like, well, we're against white patriarchy, but that really just gets boiled down to you're not white, and it's very tenuous. And I think it would not surprise me if some point you had a situation where African American leftists were saying, "Oh, Mexicans have Mexican privilege," and vice versa. You know, because you can look at, I mean, they could each cite their own grievance if we want to use contemporary data, like if you look at, say, crime statistics, right? They're harsher for African Americans than they are for Hispanic folk. That's a good case for Hispanic privilege. If
Well, we don't even have to use hypothetical, right?
Yeah.
If you look at like Ilhan Omar, right, and her recent comments, you'll see that many on the left don't seem to care very much about anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic dog whistles.
Well, that is interesting to me. It's it did seem like,
or the Women's March with their anti-Semitism, right?
It did seem like until relatively recently, anti-Semitism is a whiff of anti-Semitism on the left. Just got snuffed out fast. They would not be up for it. But now there has been a bit of a reversal. And I can't help but wonder if maybe if that is somehow related to the fact that a lot of people in the IDW end up are of Jewish heritage, right? I mean, that's true of Dave Rubin.
I don't think that's it. I mean, I don't think that Linda Sarsour was looking at Sam Harris or Dave Rubin and being like, you know, they're Jewish. You know, it's a couple of different things, right? It's Islam, right? Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, right? These are Muslim people. Not all Muslims are anti-Semites, of course, but there is a very strong and virulent strain of anti-Semitism in that community.
Yes.
In the Islamic community. And also part of it is that the far left is very anti-Israel, and they really fail to distinguish between reasonable critiques of the Israeli government and Jewish people, or the Jewish people's right to self-determination more broadly. They don't really you know what's
interesting?
They don't delineate between,
right.
Like, I've criticized Netanyahu. I made a video criticizing Netanyahu like 2 weeks ago. No, I'm not a big fan of Bibi.
Right, but you know what's interesting? What you're touching on here is it almost feels like Israel was sort of is a case that preceded a lot of this, like the angst around Israel. And there's good criticism to have about Israel, but there's also a lot of confusion about Israel that really seems to parallel the confusion that there is about the West by the left right now. And
yes.
And it seems to me that these thoughts about Israel happened way before a lot of this stuff was taking off generally in the left, in how it sees the West. Like, a lot of the attitudes you see by the left about Israel today were true of the left 10, 15 years ago. But
well, we should clarify the far left, right? The Democrats actually used to be very hardcore pro-Israel. Now it's about 50-50.
Right, but one thing that seems to be more recent, though, is in terms of how major that it's gotten in the discourse, is just applying a lot of this pessimism about Israel to the West generally. I mean, a lot of the faults that are seen of Israel are seen of the West as well. And it seems to me like that's almost like kind of a prelude itself to a lot of this stuff. And you know, if you want to know like a lot of what like I think good or bad about Israel, I mean, I think Sam Harris has touched on a lot of them.
He's talked about Israel a lot, yeah, or at least a few times.
Yeah, and
I'm pretty big pro-Israel, but there are a lot of.
I guess you could say if you put a gun to my head, I'm pro-Israel. So of all of our allies in the Middle East, if we had to get rid of them one at a time, the country at the bottom of that list for me would be Israel.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think it's pretty obvious why. It's because of Middle Eastern countries, they're actually a functioning democracy. They're not,
and they're minority citizens. Like they say, apartheid state, right?
Right.
Arabs and Muslims in Israel have more rights,
right?
Anywhere in the Muslim world.
Right. A lot of people forget. Like they focus so much on the Palestinians. Some of the Arabs in Israel, especially in the lands that were taken during the first Arab-Israeli War in 1948. A lot of those who didn't flee to the West Bank or Gaza or into Egypt stayed in Israel, and they have citizenship. When we talk about Israelis, like Israel's population is X numbers. 20% of that are Arab Israelis.
Well, and they want to be. They want
Right.
to be. Like if you look at the opinion polls, they actually had opinion polls in some of the towns that are majority Muslim, because Israel was contemplating ceding parts of some towns over to the Palestinians. So they held a poll, and the majority of Arabs said that they wanted to remain part of Israel because they liked the high standards of living.
Right.
They didn't want to join the West Bank.
And then if you just want to like a test of its democracy, the Arab Israelis are about 20% of the population. That's roughly how many seats Arab Israelis have in the Knesset, about 20% of the seats. So it's translating pretty well, I think, into fair representation in the government. Obviously, the Jews still have a strong majority and control of the government, but there's not much way to work around that, especially when there were several Arabs. I believe there are some areas in where people who are called Palestinians have been offered Israeli citizenship but refused. I think that's the case in the Golan Heights.
Jerusalem.
Yeah, Golan Heights, and I think East Jerusalem.
Yes, I mean, some of them have accepted it, but
but many haven't.
Like 80% haven't. Yeah.
Right, and if you're offered citizenship, now this isn't true of all Palestinians, of course, but from what I understand, most of them haven't accepted citizenship. And when you're offered citizenship in a democracy and you refuse, well, for one, can you imagine that offer being made to Jews under a Muslim state? Let's assume things didn't go well for Israel in 1948. Can you imagine that same offer being made?
Well, we know exactly what happened to the Jews in the Arab world.
Right.
They don't live there anymore for a reason.
Right. I suspect it would have just been the second part, and quite possibly the completion of the Holocaust in such a scenario.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
The only ones who would have survived would have been the ones who fled to the United States. But I mean, a big part of why Israel exists is because Holocaust happened and several of these Jews needed a place to go.
Well, there were also Jews living there for centuries.
there were. That's true, but the Israeli population really skyrocketed with the influx of European Jews who were basically refugees following the Holocaust.
Yes.
So I mean, a lot of it's that. So when people say, "Well, the Jews came in here and they weren't living here before," that's true to a large extent. But yeah, there were the communities who've always been there since ancient times. That were still there when the European Jews were coming, and but it just does seem to me that there's flaws with Israel, but there's confusion about how bad Israel really is on some things.
Right. The biggest critiques I would have of Israel would be Netanyahu. He's a corrupt. He's a corrupt politician. He's also what's the word? Cozied up to the far right in Israel.
Right.
Like he himself is not far right, but he's formed a coalition government because they have a multi-party system.
Right.
He's cozied up with some of the parties that are.
Right, and there's been an influx lately of those far right Orthodox Jews that have themselves are very.
It's not an influx. It's a domestic problem. It's birth rates. So when Israel was founded, only 400 or so people were ultra Orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
The Haredim, I should say. Sorry, the Haredim people. Only 400 of them were, and so they were given special, and they were also pretty opposed to the Israeli government. So the Israeli government formed basically a pact with them. They said, okay, you're a small percentage of the population, less than 1%. We're going to give you exemption from the military. We're going to give you funding for your religious institutions, and that way you'll come on board and support Israel, and you'll become full citizens. They said, okay. And so they made that deal. It was 400 of them in 1948. Now, they're about 10% of the population. And they're growing because they have 6 or 7 or 8 kids usually. And they aren't integrating at all. and they still have the special exemptions from the military, so they aren't even pressured into integrating. And this far right group, they're extreme religious nuts. I mean, they're basically the Westboro Baptist, or not the Amish. They're like the Amish here, right? But they can vote, and they're growing, and that's a problem that Israel's going to have to face in the coming decades.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they might not be a democracy anymore. That's the biggest threat to Israel, I think, right now.
All right. So you don't like Netanyahu, and
and the expansion of they haven't built any new settlements in decades, but they have expanded the existing ones. That's not good for peace in the long term.
It's a bad idea. But you know, I am often reminded of very early in the 90s. We almost finally got peace, but and Israelis were ready to. You know, they had a much more moderate government at the time. They very nearly gave in to nearly all of Arafat's demands, but because he didn't get 100%, he said no.
And he initiated the Intifada.
Yeah.
He went to war with Israel.
Yeah, and so I mean, that I think that was a point where, you know, if the ball was really in the court of the Palestinians, and they said no to peace. And you know, I think with the backdrop of with how much existential danger Israel has faced from its first day, their willingness to do that, and there's the general restraint they've shown. And again, this I think is a good point that Sam Harris made, is that Palestinians rely on the moral restraint of the Israelis as part of their military strategy. Like, they rely on the fact that Israeli soldiers are much more hesitant to, say, shoot through the bodies of children to kill Palestinian militants.
Yeah. Well, Israel is extremely moral and careful with their actions. Like, you see, like Chapo, the Trap House. It's like they're always going on about Israel murders kids, right? They call them kid killers, child killers and stuff. And it's like, no, like, obviously, if you're going to bomb an area, right, you're going to drop a bomb or you're going to engage in a conflict, some children are going to die, right? That's unfortunate, but that's a fact of war.
Right, and it's a fact of war created when the Palestinians want to shoot rockets in the neighborhoods. I mean,
right? No country would tolerate that. If
war were declared,
if El Chapo was launching rockets from Tijuana into San Diego, we'd put a stop to that in half a minute.
Right. Yeah. And then if some Mexicans die, people would probably. I would hope people would have the good sense to say, well, El Chapo shouldn't have done that. It's his fault. Because we wouldn't have done that then. But we're not going to let ourselves get bombed, and no country should. You should, government has a duty to protect its people. That's just some of the basics of what government is. Well, anyway, we're coming close to the end of our time. I want to give you just a moment now to summarize your thoughts and leave us on a positive or insightful note, or anything you didn't quite touch on. So I'll just give the next few minutes to you to do that.
All right. Well, first off, thank you for having me on. It was fun. As for summarizing my thoughts, I don't think there's really a whole lot to say. I'm pretty vacuous when it comes to thoughts. No. But when it comes to this sort of these battles we're having, these sociocultural battles, I think that ultimately we're going to have to try and be a lot more understanding. And we're also going to have to solve the underlying issues that cause people to become radicalized in the first place, whether it's the far left or the far right. And by addressing those underlying concerns and underlying issues, we can stop those movements from having power, and we can kill them off.
All right. Well,
that's really all I have to say.
Okay, and I think I agree with that. With it, we need to do something to increase the amount of communication that's going on. Maybe this podcast could be one of those places. I don't know how many people who are on the left will agree to come on here, but I am always open to that. But until then, I want to thank you for coming on, Kevin, and at least helping us fill the void. And I thought this was a very interesting topic, having been a pretty avid gamer for most of my life, but sort of being removed from a lot of these things. It's good to hear more and know how they they fit in and what we can do about them. So yeah, thanks for that. And I guess like I said to everyone else, I'll see you in the sub, okay?
All right.